There are many leading podcasters and authors who've been sending a somewhat incorrect message that high levels of insulin in itself are bad and the cause of metabolic syndrome. And this brief video is really to kind of clear up some of the misconceptions about insulin resistance and high insulin levels. And one of the main reasons to clear this up is that this misconception leads to the idea that treating people with diabetes with insulin is bad. And it also leads to the somewhat incorrect conclusion that low carbs is the ideal fix for metabolic syndrome. So let's just quickly talk about the difference between hyperinsulinemia and insulin resistance. So insulin is a hormone secreted by the pancreas, and although we most commonly think of it as a hormone which lowers glucose in the blood, it has many functions, one of them of course being causing muscle and fat cells to take up glucose, but also reduces production of glucose in the liver, increases fat production in the liver, and also inhibits fat cells from breaking down and releasing fat into the blood. One of the other actions it has is it increases cell growth. And so these are just some of the many functions that insulin has. It's worth pointing out, though, that insulin, which is released by the pancreas, is primarily released in response to glucose, with amino acids from proteins and fats having a lesser effect on insulin release. So what is hyperinsulinemia? So that's fairly simple, and it's basically having a high level of insulin in the blood, and just like any other blood test, this is based on your lab's reference range, which is determined by what the normal value across a population of a similar age and blood test done at the same time are. So hyperinsulinemia is simply just having a high level of insulin in the blood. And as we'll see, there's many causes of having a high level of insulin in the blood. Insulin resistance is a bit more complicated and in some ways confusing to understand, but very simply, insulin resistance is when the insulin released by the pancreas does not function properly and have the same effect. If you had complete resistance to insulin, and as far as I'm aware, there is no such condition where this occurs, but if you had this, then this would be lethal and would be kind of the same as, having no insulin in your, no functioning insulin in your body. But what's more common is what we describe as partial insulin resistance, where your cells across your body respond to the insulin, but they need a higher dose for insulin to have the same effect. Or in other words, for muscle to take up the same amount, a set amount of glucose, it needs a higher than average amount of insulin. And similarly, you can have insulin resistance in the liver or in the fat cells. And so this makes insulin resistance a bit more confusing in that it can be what we call selective. So you can have insulin resistance just in one tissue, such as a muscle or fat or liver. And to make things more confusing, even within one tissue, for example, take the liver, you might be more resistant in pathways which reduce glucose production. For example, the insulin may not reduce the liver from producing glucose as much as it should at a set dose, but it might still promote fat generation in the liver. So this selective nature of insulin resistance does make things a bit more confusing. But the bottom line is what insulin resistance means is that your insulin does not have the same effect that you would expect in a normal person at a certain amount of insulin in the blood, or if you're given an insulin injection, you don't have the same effect as a normal person. So insulin resistance does result in hyperinsulinemia because your pancreas needs to make more insulin to have the same effect, but it's not the only cause. And one of the issues when it comes to insulin resistance and high insulin levels is people often compare high insulins to other problems of hormonal excess, and which are treated by, as you'd expect, lowering the hormone which is high. But there are some problems with this comparison, which is what I'm going to discuss next. So if we just look at other hormone excesses, for example, a common one would be thyroid hormone excess, which is due to too much production of the thyroid hormone in a gland in the neck, and this results in increased body metabolism, weight loss, and can cause serious cardiac problems. And this is treated by either surgery to get rid of the overactive thyroid gland, or drugs which target the thyroid gland and reduce the production of hormone to a normal level. And this makes sense because the problem is in the thyroid gland. Similarly, another hormone excess example is parathyroid hormone excess, which is in another gland which happens to be in the neck next to the thyroid gland, and that's why it's called parathyroid. But this gland produces a hormone called parathyroid hormone, which results in a release of calcium into the blood. So if your calcium levels are going low, the gland releases parathyroid hormone to increase your calcium levels. And so you can have tumors of the gland which produce too much hormone, resulting in high calcium. And in this case, the treatment is surgery to remove the tumor and bring your parathyroid hormone levels back to normal. And so coming back to insulin, as I mentioned, insulin resistance is one cause of having too much insulin in the blood, but this is not a problem which starts in the pancreas. So there are other causes of high insulin in the blood, and these include tumors in the pancreas or genetic problems in the pancreas which results in high levels of insulin. And these are treated by surgery or drugs to reduce insulin. So to complete this comparison, it's worth also noting that there are other conditions of hormone resistance, and this is not mentioned by many people who make these comparisons of hyperinsulinism to other hormone excesses. So thyroid hormone resistance is actually a very rare condition, but it does exist, and it's usually due to a mutation in one of the thyroid hormone receptors, but can also occur due to issues with thyroid hormone transport and other receptors. And the bottom line is this results in high levels of both thyroid hormone level as well as what's called thyroid stimulating hormone, which stimulates the release of thyroid hormone. And the reducing thyroid hormone does not fix this problem and has its own problems. Similarly, you can get parathyroid hormone resistance, where you end up with high levels of parathyroid hormone but low levels of calcium. And this is again due to a problem with the parathyroid hormone receptor. So, these conditions of resistance are a bit confusing, but the main take home is that with each of these conditions of resistance, thyroid hormone resistance, parathyroid hormone resistance, you get high levels of the associated hormone. But reducing the hormone level, it does not fix the problem because it is not the cause of the problem. And so similarly, when we come down to insulin resistance, directly the problem is not necessarily high insulin. On a side, it's worth noting that if you're exposed to a high level of insulin over a period of time, you actually can develop insulin resistance. But this is just one potential cause. And as I briefly mentioned before, we don't really understand how insulin resistance starts, and there are many other causes which are established, including rare genetic conditions, but it's really not well understood. And my suspicion is that this is because there are potentially many causes, and people probably have multiple causes which leads to insulin resistance. But the conclusion from this video is that in insulin resistance, high insulin is not the problem. Of course, if you treat the insulin resistance, the high insulin levels will also improve. But the fact that we see high insulin in insulin resistance does not imply that insulin itself is bad, although there may be other evidence to suggest that it may have, in very high levels, have some bad effects. But the high insulin is not necessarily the problem, and any intervention should really be focused on treating the insulin resistance, which, as I've kind of mentioned now a few times, is something which we don't fully understand yet and is an area of ongoing research.